Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and OG Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, tech writer, and I've used Apple products for not quite as long as Graham.
But still quite a long time.
Oh yeah, ages. Just not as long as you.
Okay, so today's topic is NeXT Computer. What do you know about NeXT, Charlie?
I know that when Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple, he went off and started another computer company, called it NeXT, and then eventually sold that company back to Apple. Then NeXT went on to become the foundation of all of Apple's computer platforms today.
Exactly, yeah. Which is why I thought it would be such an interesting topic for us to focus on today. These years between 1985, when Steve Jobs was unceremoniously booted out of Apple, to his triumphant return 10 years later in 1997, represent a kind of wilderness years for Steve Jobs. He ran a couple of businesses over these years. One was NeXT Computer and the other was Pixar Animation. And nothing he did during these years was much of a success at the time. In fact, both Pixar and NeXT Computer bled money, as we're going to see. But everything that he did during these years would later turn out to be massively consequential. In the case of Pixar, of course, it went on to be one of the biggest animation studios on the planet. And NeXT Computer, as you said, Charlie, developed really the entire software platform on which all Apple's products are based on today. What you're looking at when you look at Apple Computer back in 1997 when it acquired NeXT is a company that was on the ropes. It had tried and failed on several occasions to develop a next generation operating system for its Mac platform, but nothing had worked and it was all out of options. Its last-ditch attempt to save the Mac platform was to acquire NeXT to get its hands on NeXT's operating system as a replacement to the Mac operating system. On paper, this did not look like a very promising proposition. And when you look at the history of tech mergers, really you see nothing but a history of failure. If you look at things like Google and Motorola, Microsoft and Nokia, eBay and Skype, and most notably AOL and Time Warner, I would argue that Apple's acquisition of NeXT Computer is probably the greatest merger in all tech history. Literally, every product that Apple makes today is based upon the technology that it acquired with this merger. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. If you're a developer for macOS or iOS, you'll be familiar with the foundation frameworks that you have to use to develop any application. And all of those frameworks, or most of them, start with the letters NS. So, for example, NS Object.
It's NeXTSTEP.
And those letters, NS, which are encoded into every Mac and every iPhone on the planet, stand for NeXTSTEP, the operating system that Apple acquired from NeXT, Steve Jobs' little baby, back in 1997. So in today's episode, we're going to wind the clock back, starting with Steve Jobs' departure from Apple in 1985 and his founding of NeXT, to understand what it was that he did in those years that was so important and why NeXT would prove to be the secret to Apple's salvation and success.
Let's do it.
Okay, so as is our custom, Charlie, before we get into it, I have a couple of trivia questions to get us warmed up.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Yes.
So the first question is, what is a 3M computer?
A 3M computer?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one.
I've got really tricky questions
Yeah,
today.
That's a nasty one. 3A, is it like, no, I don't know.
Okay, well, I'll give you a clue. The 3M computer is a spec for an ideal academic and research computer workstation that was established in the early 1980s. And the 3Ms stood for three things that started with the letter M that this computer should have. And can you guess what they were?
Let's see. Memory. I don't know.
Okay,
I'm thinking of
so you've got memory in megabytes. There's also another mega.
Oh, okay. Megabytes, megahertz, and Megatron.
Okay, so it needed a megabyte of memory,
Yeah.
it needed a megapixel display,
Uh-huh.
and it needed a MIPS. What's a MIPS?
MIPS, a million instructions per second.
Very modest specs by today's standards. In fact, a single icon in macOS 10 is probably larger than a megapixel, but this was a very high spec at the time, and it was the mobilizing mission for Steve Jobs in founding NeXT Computer was to develop an affordable 3M computer for academic and research purposes. And so we'll be coming back to the 3M computer as we get into this episode. So that's trivia question number 1. I've got trivia question number 2 for you,
Okay.
which is, what is BSD? Not to be confused with BDSM. We're talking here about BSD as in FreeBSD.
It's the Barclay something distribution. It's a kind of Unix flavor that underlies, well, macOS now, and I am assuming that it also underlies a NeXTSTEP.
Exactly so.
What's the S stand for?
Software.
Software.
Berkeley
of course.
Software Distribution. I thought you'd said that, actually.
No, I should have kept quiet.
So, FreeBSD is a Unix-compatible operating system, and bits of FreeBSD, called the BSD subsystem, were used by NeXTSTEP and later macOS 10 to give it its Unix compatibility. So we'll be coming back to FreeBSD as well. So, setting the scene, 1985 was the year that Jobs left Apple and founded NeXT Computer. It was also the year that Madonna felt like a virgin, George Michael regretted his careless whisper, and Simple Minds were crooning Don't You Forget About Me on the soundtrack of the movie classic Breakfast Club.
Oh.
Oh, fond memories there, Charlie?
Yeah, I love the movie. It's a great film. Yeah, also Live 8 was that year.
I think it was, yeah. We Are the World and all that stuff. Steve Jobs was 30 years old, and in today's money, he was a billionaire. He was young, rich, and successful. But his career was about to take a nosedive. To understand why, we have to wind the clock back 2 years to 1983. Apple had been growing fast and was a really big company, and its investors felt that Steve Jobs was too young and inexperienced to be the CEO of a company that large. So Jobs recruited someone else to be the CEO, and he would take the role of chairman instead. So Steve Jobs wanted to find the best CEO on the planet to be the boss of his company. And do you know, Charlie, who he picked?
Was it John Scully from Pepsi?
Exactly so. And do you remember how he persuaded John Scully to join Apple?
Yeah, I think he said, do you want to sell sugar water for your life, or do you want to do something important? Something like that.
Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? And who could say no to that? So Scully was Jobs' hand-picked CEO, and initially the two of them got on very well, but it didn't take long for the boardroom battles to start. Scully, at the time, was very focused on a product called the Apple II. This computer represented over 80% of the company's revenue back in the late 80s. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs was heading up the division which was working on the Macintosh platform. He ran this division as his own personal fiefdom, like a company within a company, and there was a lot of rivalry between the Macintosh division and the rest of the business.
Was this when they flew the pirate flag from their building?
It started with that, yes, when they were originally developing the Macintosh platform, and it really just escalated from there, this mentality of being renegades within the business. If you look at it from John Scully's perspective, there was this bit of the company that really wouldn't have anything to do with him. It was like a company within a company, and it was kind of undermining his authority. So you can see why he would want to do something about that. Jobs was basically asking for a run-in with the boss, and that's exactly what he got. Initially, Mac sales were very strong, and that gave Steve Jobs a strong power base within the business.
Yeah.
But quite soon, Mac sales began to flag, weakening Jobs' position, and Scully took the opportunity to make his move. Scully demoted Jobs to the position of new product development and took the Macintosh platform out of Jobs' remit. And you can imagine how Steve Jobs felt about that.
Yeah, I'm sure he was very happy.
No one puts baby in the corner, and no one puts Steve Jobs in the corner, and you definitely don't take Steve Jobs' baby away from him, which was the Mac.
It's funny, like knowing Jobs from like subsequent years, it's very funny, the idea of trying to, of anyone trying to tell him what to do in his own company.
In his own company. And that's exactly how he felt about it. Although at this point, Apple was a public company, from Steve Jobs' perspective, he'd worked there basically his entire professional life. He was a co-founder, and the Macintosh was his baby. He thought of Apple as his personal property, and it was a complete affront to all of that, this idea that someone might presume to demote him within his own company. All the stories you hear about Steve Jobs during this period tell you that he was not a very nice person. He had a temper, he was impatient, he was egotistical. He might have been brilliant and have great taste, but he was still very hard to work with. He was 30 years old, and up until this point, during his entire career, everything had always gone his way.
Mm-hmm.
Everything he had done had been successful, and no one had ever dared to challenge him on any point, ever. So he wasn't going to sit around and let Scully try to demote him. Instead, he immediately set about trying to take over the company and boot Scully out. The problem was, he couldn't get the board to take his side. And since Jobs was not willing to accept his demotion, that left him with no option but to resign. But he did try to position his departure as being amicable. He explicitly told the board in his letter of resignation that he would not be competing with Apple, and that his new company, NeXT Computer, would focus on an area that Apple wasn't really involved in at the time, which was academic and research workstations, the 3M computers that we were just talking about. There was even some talk that when he'd developed his 3M computer, he might license that technology back to Apple for them to use on the Macintosh line. But of course, it didn't quite turn out that way. All this talk about an amicable split very quickly went south. I actually think that even the name of NeXT Computer was a subtle dig at Apple.
It's true.
I guess you might have argued it was next as in the next stage in Steve Jobs' career,
Mm-hmm.
but you could equally interpret it as the next stage in computing.
This is the next thing in computing.
I think for Steve Jobs, this was all very personal. He'd had so much success with Apple, but I think when you have success at an early age, you maybe kind of want to prove to yourself and to the world that it was more than just fluke. So by setting up NeXT, Steve Jobs, I think, wanted to prove that he could do it again. What we have with Steve Jobs in this era is a guy with something to prove, and a guy with a real chip on his shoulder. Not necessarily the most psychologically well-adjusted individual. And boy, we don't know any billionaires like that these days now, do we?
No, not at all.
These days, billionaires are all well-adjusted individuals.
Well-adjusted, kind, philanthropic, and and left-wing.
So with a huge chip on his shoulder and something to prove, Steve Jobs leaves Apple and founds NeXT Computer. And he just doesn't leave by himself. He actually takes 5 senior executives from Apple with him as well. Apple actually sues him for poaching their staff. They describe him as having nefarious schemes. Steve Jobs made a comment about this. He said, "It's hard to think that a $2 billion company with 4,300 plus people couldn't compete with 6 people in blue jeans." Although I don't think Steve Jobs really thought that. I think he thought 5 people and 1 genius billionaire.
1 genius billionaire in blue jeans, in dad jeans. But I love that he has a dig at, in the sentence, there's so much in that sentence, he's like having a dig at the suits as well. You know, they're a giant, big, faceless company. He's setting them up as like the big brother that Apple went against when they went against IBM with the Mac a few years, like the year before, no?
Interesting point, yeah. He's effectively saying that Apple has become big brother like IBM was to Apple in the Macintosh launch ad. Yeah, interesting point. Jobs launches NeXT Inc. with $7 million of his own money. It's a fairly modest chunk of his fortune. As I mentioned, Steve Jobs' original goal for NeXT was to develop one of these 3M computers, and as I was researching this episode, I came across a funny story about how he got the idea for doing this. And to understand that, we have to go back a couple of years to when he was still working at Apple, and he was asked to go along to a sales meeting at Brown University. So the computer science professors at Brown told Jobs that the spec of the Mac wasn't nearly high enough for what they needed. So Steve Jobs said, "Well, what do you need?" And they said, well, basically a 3M computer, with at least a megabyte of memory, a million pixel display, and a megaflop of computer horsepower. And Steve Jobs said, oh, sure, we believe in that too. Apple will have an affordable 3M machine before anyone else. I only have one question. What's a megaflop?
Aha. Steve, so it wasn't MIPS then from the quiz?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the 3Ms maybe meant slightly different things to different people.
Do you know what a megaflop is?
Oh, you're giving me the quiz questions now.
I am. Yeah, it's my quiz now.
That's floating point operations per second.
Exactly. Very good.
So ever since then, Steve Jobs had it in mind that a 3M computer was something he wanted to build. And that was the mission that he set for NeXT. And in classic Steve Jobs style, he does it in the grandest way possible, sparing no expense. Most startups would be pretty frugal with their launch capital to maximize their runway to get a new product off the ground. Not Steve Jobs. With his $7 million in launch capital, he splurges $100,000 of it on a logo design from the trophy graphic designer Paul Rand.
There's a funny story about this. So he went to Paul Rand, who's the designer of, many logos, like the UPS logo, the good UPS logo.
Yeah.
Before it was changed for the terrible one now. What else did he do? Did he do FedEx as well? Was that his?
He did most famously the IBM logo.
Oh, yeah, the IBM logo, of course, yeah.
And still used to this day, the ABC logo.
Yeah, they're timeless. They're real classics. So Steve Jobs went to him and contracted him to come up with a logo. And he said to him, well, if you come up with a few designs, then, we'll take a look at those and pick them. And Paul Rand is very much like Steve Jobs. And this is a very sort of Jobs answer. He said, no, I'll design one for you. And you'll like that. And if you like it, you can pay for it. I think
Paul Rand said, I'll give you one logo option and you'll pay $100K whether you like it or not.
Okay, yeah. I think Jobs like that. I think he's like, okay, because that's the kind of thing he would say.
Yeah, I think you're right. And to be honest, I'm not really quite sure what I make of the NeXT logo. Charlie, how would you describe it?
Well, it's a cube, and with the 4 letters NeXT in it. It's a black cube, and the letters are in, I think, yellow, magenta, and is it green and blue?
Yeah, each letter is a different primary colour. And they're all capitals apart from the E, which is lowercase and at an angle.
It's very simple. I mean, it's a nice logo. I don't think it's that great, though, to be honest. I don't think it's as good as IBM and I don't think it's as good as the original Apple logo either, or any of the Apple logos, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good logo, but it's not a great logo. It's not an iconic logo. And I think that's the nature of Paul Rand. He was a bit hit and miss as a graphic designer, in my opinion. Another example of this would be he was commissioned to design a new logo for the motor company Ford, and it kind of sucked, to be honest, and Ford decided not to use it.
Yeah, that's not very good.
To be honest, I'm not that keen on this my way or the highway approach to graphic design. I think great design comes from dialogue, and this idea that, I will give you the answer and you will take it or leave it. I don't think that's a great approach to design. There needs to be some discourse between client and designer.
Yeah.
This ego-driven approach to design with big-name designers, I don't know. I kind of think that it sucks, and I'm curious if Steve Jobs in the later years would still have put up with it. So what we have with NeXT is a company with great technology and a terrible logo. So it's kind of perfect that it merges with a company with a great logo and terrible technology back in the 90s, which was Apple. And what they end up doing is taking the great logo from one company and sticking it on the great technology from the other company.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a nice kind of symmetry there. Paul Rand wasn't the only designer that Steve Jobs splurged a lot of money on at NeXT. There was another one, an architect. Do you remember who that was?
Yes, IM Pei.
Yes.
NeXT's headquarters had to have a fancy glass staircase, right? I mean, just like the Apple stores that came later. So yeah, IM Pei was the architect to do it.
IM Pei is the famous architect who designed the iconic glass pyramid in front of the Louvre Museum in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And this glass pyramid was the entrance to the museum, and it had a spiral staircase, a floating staircase that descended from the ground level to the entrance lobby in the basement below.
Mm-hmm.
And that pyramid leading down to a basement was the inspiration behind the Fifth Avenue Apple Store, which had a glass cube instead of a glass pyramid with a floating spiral glass staircase which descended down below. But when the Fifth Avenue Apple Store was still just a twinkle in Steve Jobs' eye, he was already commissioning the architect I.M. Pei to design a floating staircase for his luxurious headquarters for NeXT Computer in Redwood City, California, which was halfway between Cupertino, where Apple was based, and San Francisco. The office was prime real estate with a beautiful bay view. Steve Jobs spared no expense. I'm going to send you some pictures of it, Charlie. Let us know what you think. And we'll include a link to these pictures in the show notes.
So it's a very nondescript building, like 2 levels, glass and concrete. Looks, very much like a kind of California out-of-town building.
Yeah, an anonymous Silicon Valley office park.
Not the kind of place that you'd expect to walk into and see a grand staircase, to be honest. Is that it? Is that the staircase? It just looks like a normal staircase going down into a multi-story car park.
But it's a floating staircase, so I think that's what's supposed to make it special.
He was had.
During these early days of NeXT Computer, Steve Jobs' spending is out of control. He's still in the mindset of working in a billion-dollar company, and he hasn't adjusted to the idea of working in a startup again. And I guess, the guy's a billionaire, so he can keep funding this out of his own personal money, but he's spending an absolute fortune, and NeXT is not really operating like a regular business. It's spending way beyond its means. So much so that a year later, Steve Jobs needs to go cap in hand to get some top-up funding from another wealthy and famous investor. This guy is a 2-time presidential candidate, independent presidential candidate. Can you guess who that was?
Ross Perot?
Exactly so.
Was it? Really? Oh, wow.
There's one other thing I wanted to say about the company NeXT Computer before we get into its technology, and that is that it had a very unusual culture. Steve Jobs had the idea that he didn't want to have job titles, so everyone at NeXT Computer had the same job title. They were just members of NeXT, and everyone was paid the same salary, and everyone could see the payroll to confirm that that was the case. Well, what do you make of that?
What, is he some kind of communist?
I know, right?
I think it sounds fantastic. I bet it's really annoying for people who like executives who expect to get paid more.
Yeah.
And fantastic for the engineers who do the actual real work. So yeah, I'm all for it. I'm a not even a closet communist. I'm definitely a socialist. So I approve of that. What about Jobs? Did he get paid the same or?
I bet he didn't.
I bet he
It's a
didn't.
very good question, but history doesn't relate.
Probably not. This is the guy who at the founding of Apple was employee number 1 on the payroll.
Yeah.
And then Jobs was like, well, that's no good. But he's already number 1 and they couldn't change it. So he says, right, I'm going to be employee 0 then. It's like such a big baby. Oh, I'm going to be employee infinity.
So what we have is a profligate but egalitarian company. Next thing I wanted to get into was the hardware. And it will come as no surprise that Steve Jobs spared no expense on the design of his first computer. He brought in a company called Frog Design that he'd used to design some of the early Macintosh computers as well. And Charlie, do you remember what the name of the first NeXT computer was? What was it called?
I do not.
It's a trick question because it was actually called NeXT Computer.
Okay, that's what I would have said. You did trick me.
I did trick you there. It was a 1-foot cube-shaped workstation.
Yep.
And this design really began Steve Jobs' love affair with the cube shape. Charlie, what other cube designs do you associate with Steve Jobs?
Well, there was the G4 Cube,
Yeah.
which was a flawed but very cool toaster-like Apple toaster.
That was the Power Mac G4 Cube.
Then there was a Cube. Which Apple store had a Cube?
That was the Fifth Avenue Apple Store in New York.
The Fifth Avenue one, yeah, that's the one with the cube on top. What else has been a cube? Well, I think the iPod came in a cube-shaped box.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, the original iPod had cube-shaped packaging. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the NeXT Computer was the start of Steve Jobs' career-long obsession with cubes, and it was launched at a sumptuous event, a gala event, at the Louise M. Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco in 1988. However, it didn't ship for a couple more years, not until 1990, which was 5 years after the company originally launched. It retailed for an eye-watering $9,999. Do you know what Steve Jobs said when people in the media asked him if he felt bad about the computer shipping so late?
No.
You're going to love this. It's such a classic Steve Jobs quote. He said, "Late? This computer is 5 years ahead of its time."
Yeah, fantastic. Love it. That's a good one. It's a cool looking computer.
It is, isn't it?
It's so 80s though. It's really, really
Yeah.
80s, the design of it. Just like a black cube with a grill on it and I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just, well, I guess we're going to stick a picture in the show notes, but yeah, it's really cool looking.
That black colour really differentiated it from other computers like Macs that were mostly beige at the time. It made it really stand out. And it needed some differentiation, to be honest, because under the hood, these NeXT computers were basically running the exact same hardware as a Macintosh, the Motorola 68040 chip series. And although they had set out to be these 3M computers that were far more highly powered than Macs, it had taken so many years to develop them that by the time they came out, sure, they were a little more powerful than Macs, but they weren't as different to Macs as Steve Jobs had originally planned. But they were black and they were cube-shaped.
Yeah, and they did have a cool monitor as well.
Yeah, the monitor was really important because this was obviously the high-resolution megapixel display.
Right. Yeah, it's like so the monitor is also black and it has a kind of, I don't know, it looks like the stand. Okay, so the stand is like a long piece laying on the ground, and then like with an elbow at the back coming up. So it's kind of a cantilevered sort of lever holding the thing up, and it looks like it goes up and down. But yeah, it's very cool looking.
The stand to me is reminiscent of later Apple products like the iMac stand.
Mm-hmm. And the mouse has 2 buttons.
Yes. You know that thing they say about buses, that you wait for ages and then 3 come along all at once?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the same is very much true of NeXT. After 5 years in which they failed to ship a single computer, they shipped 3 in 1 year. Within months of shipping the NeXT computer, they shipped the NeXT Cube, a mid-market workstation retailing at $8,000. And later that same year, they shipped the NeXT Station at $5,000, which was a low-end pizza box-shaped workstation. None of these 3 computers sold particularly well. A couple of years later, they shipped turbo versions, still based upon the same Motorola 68040 chips, but they didn't sell well either. In fact, sales were so poor that NeXT was forced to abandon its plans for a PowerPC-based version of the NeXT workstation and pull out of the hardware business altogether, which resulted in them laying off 230 staff, which was almost half of NeXT's workforce at the time. So, the story of NeXT hardware is not a very positive one, but I've really saved the best bit till last because where NeXT really shined was in software. And this is where we get into the legendary NeXTSTEP operating system, which laid the foundation of everything Apple is doing today.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Jobs hadn't initially intended for NeXT to be a software company. In fact, he'd intended it to be a hardware company only, and he was planning to use a third-party operating system. But quite early on, he decided to pivot on that decision and bring in Arvi Tevanian, who was a brilliant software developer, to work on an operating system for his new computers, which would become NeXTSTEP. Arvi Tevanian was a recent graduate of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he had developed something called the Mac kernel. And this is Mac spelled M-A-C-H, like the speed of sound, not Mac as in the Mac computer. Coincidentally, they kind of sound the same when you say them.
Okay.
So the Mac kernel was a microkernel. And as the name suggests, a kernel in an operating system is the code right at the center on which everything else is built. Mm-hmm. And a microkernel is a different philosophical approach to what's known as a monolithic kernel. And there was a very famous monolithic kernel, an operating system, being developed around the same time that Arvi Tevanian was working on the Mac kernel. And can you guess what that was?
Operating system with a monolithic kernel.
Yeah.
Let's see. Windows?
Even more popular. Probably the biggest operating system on the planet today.
Linux?
Yes.
Ah.
At around the same time that Arvi Tevanian was working on his microkernel, Linus Torvalds in Finland was developing the monolithic kernel that would become Linux, which powers everything from Android handsets to huge server farms across the planet. The difference between a monolithic and a microkernel approach is the benefit of a microkernel in theory is that you can add drivers and stuff on top of it and swap them out easily without having to restart your system. So this is one of the early advantages that NeXTSTEP boasted, was that you could do just that. You could customize your system without having to repeatedly restart it. And that carried through to the early days of macOS 10. I don't know if you remember, but it was something that Apple used to brag about macOS 10, that you rarely needed to restart it. You could install drivers and software updates, and for most system updates, they didn't require a restart, which was a pretty neat feature. I guess they've moved away from that more these days, but that was certainly one of the original premises of NeXTSTEP and macOS 10.
Did you not have to install... I think you always had to restart when you installed a system update though, right?
It depends if it was an update to the kernel itself.
Yeah,
if it was an update to drivers, then no, in theory you shouldn't have to restart. So when Avi Tavanian came to NeXT Computer, he brought his Mac kernel that he'd been working on at Carnegie with him, and he combined that with elements of FreeBSD to create the operating system NeXTSTEP that powered all the original NeXT computers. The great thing about incorporating the FreeBSD subsystem into NeXTSTEP was that it gave it Unix-like features known as POSIX, Portable Operating System Interface, which was a spec for systems that should be interoperable with Unix. It handled things like the terminal shell, the file system, memory management, and it did all those things in a Unix-like way, which was really important for NeXTSTEP because they were selling these machines as workstations, and people in research and academia were used to working with Unix-like workstations. And of course, when NeXTSTEP was adapted to become macOS 10, those Unix-like features came with it, which proved to be very important in driving the early adoption of the macOS 10 platform with developers. But they didn't just stop there. On top of that, they built something called Display PostScript, which was a joint venture they worked on with Adobe. And Display PostScript was basically taking Adobe's PostScript language for printers, which was later used for stuff like EPS and the PDF file format. And they used this as a language to create a compositing layer for NeXTSTEP. That compositing layer controlled everything that you see on the screen, basically, like windows, scrollers, widgets, and drawing anything to the screen. Because it was a joint venture with Adobe and it was based on that PDF technology, that meant that it had great built-in support for rendering PDFs, which is actually the reason why to this day macOS is really great at rendering PDFs. But the thing was that because it was a joint venture with Adobe, there was joint intellectual property in this. So when Apple acquired NeXT, they refactored Display PostScript to take out all of the stuff which belonged to Adobe so that they could own it completely. And the new version of Display PostScript they called Quartz, and that compositing layer is still in macOS to this day. Visual PostScript gave NeXTSTEP a visual edge over other operating systems at the time. So for example, back then in the early 90s, with the Mac operating system and with Windows 3.1, if you dragged a window around the screen, the window would turn into a skeleton mode and you wouldn't see it. You'd just see an outline of its shape as you moved it, and it would only reappear when you let go. But NeXTSTEP, thanks to Display PostScript, was able to render the window moving in real time, which just gave it an extra, slick visual look when you compared it to contemporary operating systems. Another interesting innovation in NeXTSTEP that would leave a long legacy for Apple was their early adoption of object-oriented programming. This was a new approach to programming at the time, where code was written in reusable components called objects. So at the time on the Mac, applications were developed using C, but in order to do object-oriented programming, you needed languages that supported that programming style. For NeXTSTEP, NeXT used a programming language called Objective-C, which was carried over to Apple when Apple acquired NeXT, and was used right up until about 10 years ago when Swift was introduced. Even today, lots of legacy apps that you use on your Mac and you use on your iPhone are still coded in Objective-C, so it's still very much a live programming language to this day. So the object-oriented approach that NeXT took what's really quite leading edge, as another interesting bit of trivia here, they use the word kit to refer to these reusable components that they developed. And that word has stuck with Apple to this day. So when you talk about things like Health Kit or WebKit or HomeKit, the word kit is something that was introduced into the lexicon of macOS 10 when it migrated onto the NeXTSTEP platform.
I always thought it was because they really liked Knight Rider.
Well, that's contemporaneous, I guess.
Exactly.
I wanted also to say a few words about the user interface of NeXTSTEP. It wasn't just that Display PostScript made it look so slick. It also had many innovative and groundbreaking design features as well. For example, it was the first major operating system to use the 3D grey chiseled look that was later made popular by Windows 95 and macOS 8.
I'm playing with it now on an Infinite Mac.
For anyone who doesn't know, Infinite Mac is a website where you can run virtual disk images of classic Mac and NeXTSTEP operating systems, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes.
I've loaded up in the browser the NeXT operating system. I think it's great. I mean, yeah, it looks kind of old compared to now, obviously, and it does look very much like Windows 95 in this with this kind of grey, like you say, kind of the shadows, the sharp drop shadows, the chiseled look. But there's a persistent menu, although it's not a menu bar. It's like a menu box at the top left, and there's a dock on the running down the right hand side, which is bunch of tiles, but it's a bit Mac-like in a way. I mean, you can see it's easy to use. It's easy to work out what's happening and where. I quite like it.
It's interesting you mentioned the dock, because that's obviously a UI element from NeXTSTEP that made it over to macOS 10. And there's another UI element that the Finder inherited from NeXTSTEP that you're probably looking at right now.
Is that column view?
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking at right now. So that came from NeXTSTEP.
Yeah.
I love the column view. That's my favourite of all the views.
I would even say that the column view didn't just make it onto the Mac, but in a way it kind of made it onto the iPhone as well, because that list view you see on the iPhone, where you scroll up and down a list and you tap on something and it scrolls to the right, and then you see the next list. That's the way you navigate hierarchical views on an iPhone, is basically the column view.
Yeah, it's like a column view, but you only see one column at a time.
Exactly. If you're running NeXTSTEP in an emulator, then there's probably another element of the user interface that will look familiar as a Mac user, which is the spinning beach ball of death.
Yeah.
So before macOS 10, the waiting icon that you saw on your cursor was a wristwatch, but the spinning beach ball of death is actually the waiting icon for the cursor on NeXTSTEP, which made its way across to macOS 10 and is still in the operating system to this day. A couple of other things that came across from NeXTSTEP to macOS 10 is system preferences. Before macOS 10, that was called control panels, and the layout of system preferences for years was the same as it looked in NeXTSTEP. It's only very recently that the macOS has changed that to the new column view with system settings. And when you look at an Apple application, the application bar with big icons along the top in a row that you can customize and adjust, that was a UI element that came across from NeXTSTEP as well.
But yeah, this is very familiar in a way, and looking back at it, it looks kind of derivative of Windows, but I guess it was the other way around, no?
It was the other way around.
It's like
yeah.
it's like when something is a cliche. Sometimes you're looking at something very old and you realize that was actually the original.
Yeah, of course, Apple made a big song and dance about how Microsoft stole elements of the Mac user interface in Windows 95. But if you look at NeXTSTEP, you can see that Microsoft actually stole a lot of things from NeXTSTEP as well.
Yeah.
So as we discussed, the NeXT hardware didn't sell very well. So NeXTSTEP as an operating system really didn't have much chance to take off. But it did prove very popular with a certain kind of customer. Customers who were really interested in this object-oriented approach to development. And in particular, the CIA and the NSA bought a lot of NeXT machines because they were so enamored by NeXTSTEP. Another organization that was very interested in NeXTSTEP was Sun Microsystems. They're not around today, but back in the 1990s, they were absolutely huge. You might say the Sun was at its zenith. That's a gag, by the way.
That's good. Yeah, I'm laughing on the inside, Graham.
So Sun had its own Unix operating system called Solaris, and it made very expensive high-end Unix workstations based on Solaris. And their idea was that they wanted to take the Objective-C programming layer of NeXT and put that on top of Solaris so that you could run NeXTSTEP apps on Solaris. They developed this solution with Next, and it was called OpenStep. The OpenStep programming environment is actually what later on macOS 10 became Cocoa. There were other companies that were interested in this too. For a while, Next collaborated with Microsoft to develop OpenStep for Windows NT, but that didn't really go anywhere, and after a few years, Microsoft canned that. At around the same time, Next developed another important technology, which was called Web Objects. Do you remember this?
Yeah, the name rings a bell.
So Web Objects was an application server, and around this time, the web was really evolving from static pages, where you click from one page to the next, to much more dynamic web applications, where the web pages could talk to web servers and deliver dynamic user experiences in real time. And to do that, you needed more than just a basic web server. You needed what was called an application server. And Web Objects was a very early version of this application server technology that was built using Next's object-oriented approach. It was a pioneer in the space, but it was also very expensive, which held back its widespread adoption, and at the same time some great open source alternatives like Apache, Tomcat and JBoss were emerging on the scene. But nonetheless, when Apple acquired Next, Web Objects proved to be a really important asset, because Apple used it to build the original Apple Store, where you could buy Macs online, and they also used it to build the iTunes Store. But that said, Apple is not highly regarded for its services, and Web Objects is not around today, so you can make of that what you will.
Well, yeah, it hasn't got much better though. If you look at Apple Music app, which is a web view inside an application wrapper, and that's still terrible. It doesn't remember the state. I mean, it's worse than iTunes, and everybody complained about iTunes.
Is that really a web view in the Apple Music app?
Yeah, I think it is.
Apple's doing web views in its own apps.
Maybe a very recent version isn't, but yeah, it was for a while.
So, we had a brilliant operating system in NeXTSTEP, but it was rather held back by the lack of popularity of Next hardware. That said, there were still some very high-profile users of the NeXTSTEP operating system, and some of them very famous indeed. Charlie, can you name any of the famous NeXTSTEP users we had back in the 90s?
Users of NeXTSTEP? Actual, individual people?
One of them for sure, yeah.
I don't know, let's see.
One of them was a certain person working at CERN, the particle accelerator lab in Switzerland. He developed an application on NeXTSTEP called World Wide Web.
Tim Berners-Lee.
Exactly. The world's first web browser was built on NeXTSTEP, which is a pretty big claim to fame.
I was going to say Jerry Seinfeld.
Didn't he have a classic Mac on his desk, not a NeXTCube?
Yeah, but if they'd have carried on, if they'd have carried on instead of making that terrible, terrible final episode, then maybe he would have gone on to buy a NeXTCube.
You can actually still see Tim Berners-Lee's Next computer that he used to develop the world's first web browser at the Science Museum in London, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. Another high-profile fan of Next computer was the games developer John Carmack at ID Software, and the original versions of both Doom and Quake were developed on a NeXTCube.
I thought you were going to tell me that Doom ran on the NeXTCube, and I was thinking Doom runs on everything.
It does now, but it didn't at the time.
I think it runs on a toothbrush. I think a couple of months ago somebody ran it on an electric toothbrush.
Okay, so rounding this up, I wanted at this point to zoom in on Steve Jobs at this time and look at what was going on. What we had was this self-made billionaire in today's money, and he thought that he couldn't fail. Everything that he touched had been a success. And then he gets booted out of his own company, and he really has something to prove. And that's really what he set out to do with Next. He wanted to prove them all wrong and show that he could do it again, and that Apple had made the huge mistake by letting him go. But it didn't quite turn out that way. He built brilliant computers. He developed a brilliant operating system. He hired some brilliant talent, like Arve Tavanian that we talked about, and also John Rubinstein, the head of hardware at Next, who later went on to become the head of hardware at Apple and served there right up until 2007. Throughout this whole time, you can see he did what he's really done his whole career, which was focusing on excellence. But even though he managed to build excellent things at Next, nothing somehow really took off commercially. Now, at the same time that he was working on NeXT, he had another side hustle, which was a company called Pixar. At the time, Pixar was not the famous movie studio we know today. It was actually a software development company focused on developing a product called RenderMan for producing 3D rendered animations. This was a company that he'd acquired from George Lucas and Industrial Light and Magic. Rather like NeXT, it had lots of really, really cool software, but it was kind of struggling to find a market for itself. And during these wilderness years for Steve Jobs, he poured an absolute fortune into both companies, really trying to make them take off. And in the case of both companies, they produced excellent products, but somehow Steve Jobs failed to find a market for those products. I think Steve Jobs had this almost supernatural belief that if he built great products, then people would buy them. And he did build great products, but people didn't buy them. Ed Catmull, who was the CEO of Pixar, tells this amazing story where he and his team had made this decision that they wanted to pivot from being a software development company to getting into making movies, which was really an outlandish proposition.
Ridiculous.
Right? I mean, imagine switching from software to movie making.
It seems crazy from that side of now we know how it turned out, but yeah, looking at it from the other side, it does seem absurd.
I've got a quote for you to read here, Charlie, about this period.
Do I get to do my Johnny Ive impersonation?
No, this one's actually from Steve Jobs, so you get to be Steve.
Not today.
He's talking about how he reacted when John Lasseter approached him asking for funding to make a movie. That's John Lasseter, who would later direct Toy Story.
I kept putting more money into Pixar, and the only bright spot was John's short films. He'd say, "Can I have $300,000 to make a short film?" And I'd say, "Okay, go make it." That was the only thing that was fun. Everything else was not really working.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. It's funny because he knew everything wasn't working, but he's still throwing money into it. So I wonder what he saw coming out of it. You know, if the whole of Pixar's not going great, and like what is it that he sees changing that's going to turn it around? If he's willing to keep throwing money and keep the place running, it seems a kind of odd.
My personal view is I take what Steve Jobs says there at face value. I think he was investing in this because it was fun and because John Lasseter was doing good things. And I think that Steve Jobs had this, almost religious faith that if you do good things, it will work out. I think it's much easier to have that perspective if you're a billionaire and nothing you've ever done has ever failed.
It's true, but he wasn't a billionaire when they started Apple, and that was really the same kind of vibe.
I guess what I mean is that throughout his entire career, he's never had any failures. From when he famously launched Apple Computer with his buddy Woz in his parents' garage, everything he had ever touched through his whole career up until this point had been a success. And so I think he believed maybe that it always would be. That's, I think, where his supernatural faith in the fairness of the business world was. You do great things and you'll succeed, because he always had done great things and he always had succeeded. So the money that John Lasseter was asking for, that Steve Jobs is talking about in that quote, is the investment that he needed to make Luxor Jr., a film that would later go on to win an Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. But there was no way Steve Jobs could have known that at the time. It was purely his faith in great people and great work that led him to that decision.
I guess in a way it's not unlike investing, like angel investors who come along and just put money in things that they think they think they're going to make money, but they do it because they think they're good. They see things that are promising and put money into it without necessarily wanting, I guess the idea of an angel investor is that you don't necessarily want to pay out, but of course they do.
To me, the difference here is that angel investors make a lot of bets on a lot of different companies, hoping that they will find one which is a unicorn, one which is an Uber or a Meta.
Two beautiful companies.
And the losses on all the other ones will be offset by the massive value in that one unicorn they find. Whereas Steve Jobs in this time just had those two bets on NeXT and Pixar. He's investing in people that he trusts, like John Lasseter and Arve Tavanian and John Rubinstein. And he is investing in products that he believes are excellent. And I've got another quote here, Charlie, for you from Ed Catmull, the CEO of Pixar.
Can I do it in a voice like this?
He has a Californian accent, I think.
I just called Ed, so I was thinking Ed Harris, I guess. Okay. Steve took a chance on us and believed in our crazy dream of making computer animated films. The one thing he always said was to simply make it great. Here's why Pixar turned out the way we did. And his strength, integrity, and love of life has made us all better people. He will forever be a part of Pixar's DNA.
Which is really interesting because the way that Ed Catmull describes it is during this period of Steve Jobs' wilderness years, he changed as a person. Prior to getting kicked out on his ass by Apple in 1985, people described Steve Jobs as mercurial and a bit of an asshole. But during these years, when he was running NeXT and Pixar, Catmull says that he learned empathy. And maybe all these setbacks and challenges that he faced were what he needed to find a way to put his trust in others, build teams, and invest in people.
Now I know why you humans cry.
Yes, exactly like that. I think what we have here is basically the plot of Terminator 2. So Steve Jobs changed a lot during his NeXT and Pixar years, but I think there's one thing that he held on to which didn't change during that period, which is his obsession with excellence. And I think that's what always made him difficult to work with. If you couldn't live up to his standards of excellence, or if you couldn't stick up for yourself when he was really challenging you to achieve those levels of excellence.
Yeah, I see that. But when he came back to Apple, he wasn't much better. I think he was still kind of an arsehole. But it seems, is it possible that because in Apple and NeXT, especially in Apple, he knew a lot. He knew about computers and he knew exactly what he wanted. And even though maybe he wasn't an engineer himself and couldn't write the software or design the hardware, he really knew exactly what he wanted. He knew how it worked and how to use it. And so he knew when people didn't come up to his standards. It was his field, his expertise. Whereas when he's talking to people at Pixar, then I think he realizes people who are really excellent in their fields, like John Lasseter and his team. And he kind of was more hands off because he knew that it wasn't his field. So he just okay, you guys are excellent at this, so get on and do it. And you've got my support as long as you make it great. I don't know how that relates to NeXT, if he is actually nicer to people at NeXT, or maybe he wasn't.
I think yes and no. My reading of this is people that had Steve Jobs' respect had a great working relationship with him. But if they weren't able to live up to his exacting standards, then he wouldn't hesitate to boot them out. And I guess having had the experience of being booted out himself in 1985, then he was even more ready to do that to other people if they didn't meet his exacting standards.
Right.
Another point that Ed Catmull makes is that the team that Steve Jobs gathered around him at Pixar and at NeXT at this time stuck with them pretty much for the rest of their careers.
So who did he have there?
So that would be people like John Rubinstein and Arve Tavanian. And I think that speaks to the strong working relationship that he had with them. During Steve Jobs' second stint at Apple, a lot of senior executives stayed with him for decades. It was one of his real strengths, was his ability to retain talent. And if you look at people like Scott Forstall or Johnny Ive, they worked with Steve at Apple for decades, and they only left after Steve passed away.
Yeah.
So, I think he was actually in his second era at Apple after his wilderness years at NeXT. He had become very strong at retaining talent. And you can't do that if you're an arsehole to everyone.
No, that's true. Forstall was one of Jobs' golden boys, no?
Yeah, he was. So I'm not saying during this next period that Steve learned to become this yogic master, spiritually enlightened being, but he did learn how to identify, recruit, motivate, and retain talent. And that was a key component to his success in his second stint at Apple. So in this episode, we've told the story of NeXT, right up until the point in 1997 when it's on the brink of being acquired by Apple. And that's where I'm going to leave it in this episode. Our next episode is going to be about macOS 10, and we're going to start with how Apple came to buy NeXT and how the assets that NeXT possessed, specifically the NeXTSTEP operating system, were proved to be so transformative for Apple's business. That combined, of course, with the influx of senior talent that came from NeXT, not least Steve Jobs himself. I've always had a theory that the X in macOS 10, written as an X, is an oblique reference to the X in NeXT. I think it was a sentimental move on Steve Jobs' part. As he was moving on to the next phase in his career, he was making a reference to his wilderness years, that time at NeXT, which had been so transformative for him as a business executive. So next episode is all about how NeXT transformed Apple and gave us the company that we know and love today. Any last words you'd like to add, Charlie?
No, I don't think so. This has been a very interesting episode. I don't think I have anything to add.
I've left you speechless, Charlie.
You've left me speechless. I know it doesn't help. It never happens. I've always got some stupid comment.
Okay, well, I think we can wrap it up there. Be sure to join us for our next episode.
For join us for which episode? Our next episode.
Next episode. Very good. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this episode and you're feeling generous, please do give us a star rating in the Apple Podcast app, and even maybe a review. It really helps to increase our visibility as we're trying to build up the following for the show. And Charlie, if people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
You can find me at Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social on that's Mastodon.
And you can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. I am at Graham Bauer. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our sound engineer, Martin Algerston, for making us sound so fabulous in this episode. And until next time, bye-bye.
Goodbye.